a lecture, and they were like, well, this just doesn't make sense. We openly share our methodology and the tools and the software, and actually, if we charged people, they wouldn't use it. And what we want to do is we want to go and we want to present and say, this is what we use, this is the software, and people need to be able to have access to it so that it's popular. So these are things that it doesn't always fit, and you need to be able to ask the questions on whether or not it's something that you want to pursue. Has anyone seen The Social Network? Yeah. Okay, I haven't yet, sorry. But I do know that there's an example that they actually presented this to the university, correct? I'm sure it was dramatic, made a little more exciting in the movie. But Google is another option where the students actually came and said, hey, we have this idea, and the university was like, yeah, not really interested. So it happens. I mean, those are two very popular concepts of people just developing these ideas and going through this process and how it results. All right, our next speaker, sorry, is eating, so I will introduce her while she finishes, is Suzanne Rivera. She's the Associate Vice President of Research, and she's going to talk about conflicts of interest.
Is it a conflict of interest I'm getting free food
yes.
in order to do this
No free lunch.
Is that on? Can you hear me in the back? Great. Good morning. Thanks for having me. I was pleased to meet some of you in small group yesterday, and we'll do small group again this afternoon. As you already heard, my name is Suzanne Rivera. In addition to being Associate Vice President for Research at CASE, I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Bioethics. And before coming to CASE, worked at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas for 7 years and at UC Irvine for 7 years. So I've been doing this for a little while, always in the capacity of supporting the research enterprise. I have responsibility for a variety of regulatory apparatus, including conflict of interest, but also the Institutional Review Board that oversees use of human subjects in research, the Biosafety Committee, which oversees use of recombinant DNA and other potentially harmful agents in research. And my office also processes all contracts and grants for research that come into the university, and we handle allegations of scientific misconduct. So we think of ourselves as kind of the research support unit that we wrap around the investigator and help them navigate all of the different regulatory and administrative burdens that can sometimes make research feel like it's really difficult to do. But the way we take our mission is that it's your job to come up with the brilliant ideas, and it's our job to help you test those and get your work done. So even though I'm going to focus on conflict of interest for purposes of today's talk, I want to invite you that after it's over, if you have questions about other aspects of the research enterprise, or if you want to follow up with me later on, you can find me through the CASE website, and I'm happy to help and consult with any kind of research regulatory type question you may have. So I always like to start with a cartoon, and for conflict of interest, I like this one, not just because I find it funny, but I want to illustrate a point for you. And the point is that conflict of interest is kind of a weird term, because it's the kind of thing where when we hear it, we know that it's something that makes us uncomfortable, but we're not always sure why it's uncomfortable. We think maybe there's something not right, there's some hanky-panky going on, but we're not sure exactly what it is. So in this case, what I find sort of interesting is, what exactly is it about this cartoon that makes us feel icky? Is it the ick factor of the implied cannibalism we feel when we ponder a cow selling hamburgers? Is it the implied harm to the farmer because his employee, the cow, is spending time benefiting a business other than the farmer's farm, and that's a conflict? If I try to analogize it to the research enterprise, the critical issue really is whether the cow can be objective about the way he conducts his duties when he has an interest in this business outside of the farm. And it appears that it's an interest the farmer was not previously aware of. You don't get the sense that the farmer approved him working at the hamburger stand, right? The farmer doesn't seem happy about this. So obviously we're not cows, and this is not a farm, but the rules and the logistical requirements for managing conflicts of interest at universities and academic medical centers are very complicated, and the landscape both from a regulatory perspective and in the context of shifting public perceptions, is moving under our feet. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that we understand the vocabulary. Some people use the terms interest and conflict as if they're interchangeable, but they're really not. We all have interests. They may be personal interests, they may be professional interests. So examples of financial interests would be money that somebody's going to pay you. It could be stock, equity in a company. But there are also non-financial interests like feeling satisfied in your work, getting glory for doing a good job, getting tenure, getting a promotion. And just because you have an interest, or even two interests, doesn't necessarily mean you have a conflict. And even if you do have a conflict, or if there's an apparent or a potential conflict, it doesn't mean that that in itself is an ethical violation of any kind. So it's really important for us to be careful about the words we use, because as came up in our small group discussion yesterday, accusing somebody of some kind of an ethical violation is pretty serious. I mean, them's fighting words, you know. If you say that you think someone's behaving unethically or somebody has a conflict of interest, it's important to be really careful so that you don't harm unintentionally or intentionally somebody's reputation when it really may not be a problem. So with regard to conflicts, it's important to note that even a potential conflict can create an environment that casts doubt on your research or that could harm research participants. So conflicts could either be real, actual, or potential. They could be perceived. They might be harmful. They might be totally insignificant. They may not bring harm. So when we analyze a potential conflict or an actual conflict to determine whether it's allowed to be permitted, what we look at is whether that potential or real conflict could be harmful to the scientific process, to participants in research, to colleagues at other institutions, to humankind or society in general. Now this is a really bad graphic. I'm still trying to get a better one. It's a newspaper headline from a story. Most people would point to this story as the beginning of the new era of thinking about conflict of interest in research. In 1999, a young man named Gelson died as a result of his participation in a research study. And his death sort of marks a new way of thinking about conflict of interest. He was a teenager whose parents agreed to enroll him in a human gene transfer, or sometimes what's called gene therapy trial, at the University of Pennsylvania Medical Center, in which Jesse was injected with genetically altered virus designed to treat his liver disorder. After he died, it was revealed that the PI on the study was receiving personal monetary benefits from the company sponsoring the study and would have gained financially through patent royalties if the experiment had succeeded. These outside interests were not disclosed to Jesse or his parents during the informed consent process that led to his enrollment on the study. Now, more recently, you may be aware, if you read the newspaper or watch the news and you pay attention to research-related stories, you may be aware that Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley has made it his personal crusade to shine a spotlight on physicians' lucrative financial ties to industry. Since 2009, he has sent over 30 very sternly worded letters to university presidents around the country, taking them to task for allowing some of their researchers to earn hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, millions of dollars in consulting income while doing research studies related to the companies that paid them. These bulleted cases I've provided for you are just a few that Senator Grassley has exposed with great fanfare and much attention from the media. In several cases, the people involved lost their jobs, and there was great harm to not only their reputations professionally, but also the reputations of the institutions at which they worked. So one thing to keep in mind as you develop your own professional scientific career is that your behavior doesn't just reflect on you, it reflects on your profession and on your institution. And institutional harm is something that's very difficult to quantify, but you can imagine that harm to an institution's reputation could cost it in terms of donors who no longer want to give money because they've lost confidence. It could bring them lots of negative media attention in their local or even the national market, and it can affect the ability of other researchers at that institution to get funding for their research, because funding agencies may be less likely to have trust and confidence in their institution, thinking that the research support apparatus must be weak if that terrible thing was allowed to happen there. The last time I gave this talk, I told a personal story about this. One of the doctors that was exposed as part of Senator Grassley's investigation was actually the PI on a study that my family participated in at Harvard. And one of the things that I find so interesting about this whole question of conflict of interest is that a lot of the rules we have are based on the presumption that if people knew about the financial interests of the physician scientists, it would change their behavior about whether to enroll in a study. Meaning, if you knew this doctor was getting paid by an outside company, you'd be more wary, you'd be less trusting, and you would ask more questions and be more critical when you do your analysis about whether to participate. But I think sometimes we are not really looking at data, but we're making assumptions about how people would respond. So in my particular case, when I saw the newspaper article about this doctor from Harvard having received millions of dollars in consulting fees from the companies that made the products that he was testing in my brother, who was the research subject, I forwarded an article to my mother, and I said, if you had known that Dr. So-and-so was getting all this consulting income, would it have changed your decision about whether to enroll my brother in the study? And her answer was, it would have made me more likely to enroll, because I would have thought, well, if those companies are paying him all this money, he must really know what he's doing. He must be the expert, and now I'm more likely to want him involved in our family's care. So I share that story, not because you care about my personal life, but because I think it's sort of instructive that we need to take into account real human behavior when we set up these regulatory systems, and I'm not always sure that happens. I'm not always sure the people in Washington who make these rules are thinking through all of the effects of them. But that said, there really are harmful conflicts of interest, and we really do need to attend to them. And one of the reasons we need to attend to them is that we're operating in an environment of mistrust. So I told you I like to start talks with a little cartoon, and I had that one about the cow and the hamburger stand, but I actually have a whole 3-ring binder full of cartoons about research, either about the mad scientist or about the greedy doctor or something in the laboratory. And why do I have it? It's because it is such a pervasive theme. I would challenge you to read the newspaper over the next week and see if 5 days go by when there isn't some cartoon that has a caricature or a stereotype or something, either about the greedy doctor or the mad scientist. The media and the public are concerned and mistrustful about what we do in the scientific enterprise. So that makes it incumbent upon us to behave with utmost integrity. We need to earn their trust so that we can continue to do the work we're doing, because most of us do our work with taxpayer dollars. Our institution operates with taxpayer dollars, so we owe it to the public to behave with integrity. So when we concern ourselves with conflicts of interest, and we try to identify them and address them and mitigate them, there are 3 primary kinds of conflicts we are most concerned about. The first one is the one you're probably most familiar with, and that's the investigator conflict. That's when a PI either invented the thing that they're studying, and so you can imagine if you invented it and then you're studying it, you have a personal interest in wanting it to be successful. You might not overtly fudge data in order to make it look successful, but you might be, in a more subtle or unconscious way, motivated to see the data in a certain light, or motivated to enroll subjects who are more likely to have a successful experience because you have this other interest in wanting to see your invention be successful. Another kind of PI conflict of interest would be if you, as the investigator, are consulting for a company. Let's pick any pharmaceutical company. You're consulting for that company. They pay you $50,000 a year to give talks. Now that company wants to sponsor a research study and have you be the PI. The question is, by the nature of your consulting relationship with that company, are you disposed to behave a certain way? to pay a certain kind of attention to the data, to want it to be a more successful study because you want to keep your financial relationship with that company healthy because you want to keep that gravy train coming. And then the third kind of PI investigator conflict that we sometimes see, although less and less, because more of a spotlight has been shined on this, is when the sponsor rewards an individual PI for meeting certain study goals. So this would be like the sponsor contracts with a PI to do a clinical trial and says, we're going to pay your university $50,000 for you to do this trial, and that's all totally above board. But in addition, if you can meet certain enrollment targets, we're going to send a $10,000 check directly to your house that the university doesn't need to know about. Or if you can meet certain enrollment targets, we're going to take you and your whole study team on a boondoggle to Hawaii at the end of this. Those kinds of incentives. So you can imagine the kind of pressure if somebody was feeling like I'm having trouble making ends meet and the sponsor is dangling a financial reward out there. You have to enroll 30 people by Friday. You're only at 28 people. Somebody walks in the door. The hematocrit is supposed to be 10 in order to meet the enrollment criteria, and they're at 9.8. Might you, in some subtle, unconscious way, be motivated to record it as a 10 so that you could get that bonus by Friday? You'd like to think no, but the reason sponsors offer these inducements is because they work, right? For-profit companies are not in the business of giving money away just out of the goodness of their hearts. The reason they come up with these inducements is because they know people are motivated financially. So those are examples of investigator conflicts. Are there any questions about that? Okay, the second kind of conflict we are concerned about is an institutional conflict, and that's where the university itself has more than one interest that could be in conflict. For example, let's say a company wants to sponsor a study here. It turns out that company is a spin-off from university research. The company is owned by Case professors. They invented the technology in the course and scope of their university duties. Whatever they came up with is really pretty cool, so they spin off this company, and now they want to give money back to the university to pay for somebody to further develop that technology. So you might say, well, what's the conflict? Well, let's imagine that the company wants terms that we would ordinarily never agree to, like a gag order on publications or like a waiver of indirect costs. Is it possible that the institution would subtly pressure or overtly pressure the research oversight apparatus to agree to terms that were not favorable to the university because we own equity in that spin-off company and we have a financial motivation to want to see the company be financially successful? Same would be true if the university holds a patent on something. If we hold a patent and the thing is successful in the marketplace, we stand to rake in lots of money through royalties. There are many universities in the country that make big bucks through royalties. Several University of California campuses, for example, have patterned a certain kind of strawberry or a certain kind of orange that then industrial, farming companies have to pay the royalties back to the university to be able to produce that. Or when I was at UC Irvine, there were investigators who developed a kind of a freezing spray that goes on skin before you do a laser procedure to prevent burning and discomfort. Millions of dollars coming into Irvine every year for that. So if you as case investigators develop a technology and patent it, and we can commercialize that, meaning that we persuade an outside company to license the technology in order to produce a product and bring it to market, the university stands to make lots of money. Now, we share the money with the investigator. If you're the investigator, you get 50%. That's pretty generous. A lot of other institutions only give the investigator 25 or 30%. So we give the investigator, the inventor, 50%, but still the university gets 50%. So if the royalties are $10 million a year total, the investigator and the institution stand to make a pretty penny. So the question is it possible that those financial inducements could influence our behavior, our decision making in any way? Does that make sense? Okay, the third kind of conflict that we attend to is conflicts among people who serve in an oversight capacity, like members of the committees that oversee human and animal research, or for that matter, who sit on the Conflict of Interest Committee or the Biosafety Committee or any other body that oversees and sort of polices or regulates research. The issue there, the concern would be, Do you want a member of the IRB reviewing your protocol if they're a co-investigator on somebody else's study on a competitor study? Or would it be okay if somebody reviewed a protocol but their spouse was the PI, or for that matter, their ex-spouse who they're really angry at was the PI? You don't want the people reviewing protocols to have any kind of outside interest. You want them to look at the merits of the study and to bring as much objectivity as possible to their review. So we ask all of the members of our regulatory committees to disclose if they have a real or apparent conflict of interest in the review. And actually, we ask them, it's a little bit, some of it is in our eye, but some of it is in the eye of them as the beholder, meaning if they feel uncomfortable for any reason, like let's say they're going up for tenure this year, and the PI is somebody who's going to be on their P&T review committee in their department, they might say, you know what, I just would prefer not to review this one, because I don't want to feel pressured in any way to approve their protocol just because they're going to have a vote in my tenure review. So we really let the investigators tell us there are certain baseline things where we say you really can't review the protocol. But if they have a feeling of discomfort above and beyond that, we ask them to recuse themselves and not participate, because we want to protect as much as possible the objectivity of that peer review process. Make sense? Any questions? All right, so these are the main kinds of conflicts we're concerned about. So when you think about all the ways we might encounter conflicts in the research enterprise, you can begin to see that addressing them would be a delicate balancing act, because we don't just deal with conflicts that spring up on their own. We actually encourage and reward the kinds of entrepreneurial activities that lead to thorny conflicts. In other words, we want you to be entrepreneurial. We want you to have relationships with industry. We want you to bring in research dollars. We want you to invent new technologies. So we're not just passively sitting by waiting for a conflict to erupt. We're encouraging you to go out and do the very kinds of things that we then end up having to manage in a very careful way. So how is a researcher supposed to operate in that environment? It sounds like a little bit of a paradox. We do have guideposts that we use for addressing these things. The AAMC has been sort of a thought leader in the area of managing conflicts of interest in research, and I've listed for you here, just in case you're interested enough to want to read these, the titles of 3 monographs they've put out. And in a way, what's interesting about reading all 3 is that it sort of shows you how the thinking on this subject is evolving over time. You know, one of the things I said in my small group yesterday was that technology always moves, science always moves faster than regulation. So we're just always running to catch up, because people are pushing the boundaries of science, and the legal and regulatory apparatus that manages research is always 2 steps behind. So as far back as 2001, we had some good guidance, but it's evolving over time. And if you're interested enough to Google these, you can read them online. In addition, we have federal regulation. So the Public Health Service, which is an arm of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, has a policy. It's officially called their Objectivity and Research Policy, but it's basically their conflict of interest policy. What they're saying is the way we're addressing objectivity is to identify, manage, or prevent conflicts. And this policy is applicable to any institution that receives grants for research from DHHS, from the Department of Health and Human Services. So it applies to any member of a study team, not just the PI, also the investigator's spouse and children. Because the idea here is that it really wouldn't be appropriate for you to say, no, I don't have a conflict. My spouse owns the company, but I don't have a conflict, because obviously you're motivated by your partner's financial interests too. So we ask, does the investigator or any member of the study team or their spouses or dependent children have a financial interest in the company, an officer position in the company, stock in the company, etc.? And what the policy tells us is that if an interest in a company is greater than $10,000, the government thinks that interest is significant enough to be worthy of our attention, either to reduce the interest, to put in place a management plan, or to eliminate the conflict by saying, you cannot be the PI on this study because you have a significant interest in the company, either that's sponsoring the study or that manufactures the drug or device under study. Yes?
So do these rules cover, like a dependent child would be someone who's below legal age? So these rules don't necessarily cover independent children, like grown up and financially independent, but I mean, you're still attached to your children afterwards.
I agree, and I've seen investigators do what I would consider sort of unscrupulous things by putting their assets in the name of an adult child or an in-law, because in-laws are not technically a part of this either. You know, I don't own the company, my mother-in-law does, but I don't. I think this is one of those areas where it's really important that we all are behaving with honor and integrity. And it's true that the rules only cover spouses and dependent children in a technical sense, but I think you can tell that the spirit of this is, in order for your research results to be considered above reproach, you want to be squeaky clean. So if it's really important to you to be involved in this study, you and nobody directly around you should have a significant financial interest in the company. And if your financial interest is that important to you, don't do research sponsored by that company. You know, it's sort of your choice. So the way we deal with it, I'll get you in a sec. The way we deal with it is that we ask all of our researchers to tell us every year what their financial interests are. And we don't just tell them to tell us what do they have that's over 10,000. We say tell us all your outside financial interests, all the income you make, all the stock you have outside of your university pay. And then we look at that and we compare it to their research portfolio. And if we see something that appears related, then we look into it further and we decide whether we need to manage it. So if your outside interest is in something completely unrelated to your field, you know, if my outside employment is that I'm a soccer referee on Sundays, that's great, I disclose it, but the university doesn't care because it's not in any way related to my university duties. But if my outside income is to give talks about Ritalin and I'm a pediatrician who does research into ADHD, that could be related, and then we're going to look at that more closely. Does that make sense? Yeah, there was a question over here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, how do you quantify, you know, particularly early stage or like, you know, equity interest if you know, you're the co-founder of, you know, a new company or a new product, you know, you have 50% of it, maybe it's, you know, valuated at $1 million or something, but like, that's, you know, not real money.
Yeah.
Let's say it's $10,000 when you may not have any money in the company yet, but you own the future of what would happen.
Right. That's a very good question. The question was, how do you value non-cash interests? And the answer is that we would consider any officer position, ownership position, or stock as significant. So it's like 10,000 in cash or these things at any dollar value. It doesn't mean we're going to prohibit the activity, but it means we're going to look at it more closely.
Is there any like ownership? Like you have 5%, 2%, 50%?
I would say for us to take a closer look, there's no threshold. But then it gets down to the specifics of the case. And when we look at a case, we present the full portfolio of the investigator's activities in the context of their university duties. And a committee of other investigator scientists sits around the table and decides whether they think it's reasonable, whether they think that outside interest could influence the university research, and if they think there's the appearance of harm or an appearance of a conflict that could undermine the objectivity of the science, then what we typically do is, our first pass is that we just go back to the investigator and say, you choose. Do you want to do this study or do you want to have this outside interest? But we think having them together is a problem. Was there another question back here somewhere? No? Okay. So the way that we go about the process of addressing conflicts of interest is that first we have a system to identify outside interests. And the way we do it here is through an annual disclosure form that we also ask people to update whenever their information changes. So you submit it annually, but if partway through the year you get a new consulting gig with a company that's going to pay you $20,000, we want you to submit another form at that time because your circumstances have changed. So any faculty member and anybody else conducting research under the auspices of the institution is supposed to file this outside interest disclosure form. And it's online. I'll show it to you in a minute. Then all the members of the regulatory committees I told you about, the IRB, the IACUC, the IBC, et cetera, we also ask them to disclose their outside interests and to recuse themselves from protocols if they have a real or apparent conflict. Then we review all of those, and like I was explaining a minute ago, we basically stratify them or triage them based on the information we're provided. So if somebody reports 0 outside interest, we just set those aside. If they report an interest between, or if they report an interest between 0 and 10,000 in cash, we send them a letter that says, thank you for disclosing, but the amount that you've disclosed doesn't pass the significance threshold and we don't need to look at this any more closely, but if your circumstances change and you earn more than 10,000 from this entity, you need to notify us. And then we set those aside. And then we have all the other ones, which are cash above 10,000 from a single entity, or officer, inventor, stock owner, whatever. And we look at those, and then we pull information about that investigator's research activities. What IRB protocols do they have open? What IACUC protocols do they have open? What invention disclosures have they made? What patents do they hold? And we compare their outside interests with their university research responsibilities to see if there are any areas of relatedness or overlap. And if it looks like there's an area of overlap or relatedness, we take that case to the Conflict of Interest Committee and we ask them to really dig into it, debate it, think about it. In what way does this outside interest appear to have influence on the investigator's scientific work? Could that be mitigated somehow? What if the investigator were a co-I instead of a PI on that protocol, and you had somebody else responsible for the data analysis? What if there were a data safety monitoring board outside the university that took a second look at all the data? Would that be enough? We really try to be creative about coming up with management plans that allow work to move forward if it can. It's not our job to say no, it's our job to say, under what circumstances could we say yes? Because we don't want to halt the research, but we do want to protect the investigator from allegations of misconduct, and we want to protect the scientific process and the institution's reputation. We also want to, in the case of clinical trials, protect potential subjects from the possibility that the investigator could have other kinds of motivations they're managing at the same time as they're managing the trial. So that may sound like it's pretty straightforward, but actually it's a huge job and it's never ending because we only have a couple of staff in my office and we have thousands of faculty and researchers. So these forms come in this deluge and we're constantly sorting them and triaging them and taking them to committee. The committee meets once a month and we're bringing a bunch of cases to the committee to review, and then in between meetings people are submitting those updates. Remember I told you that if people's circumstances change they have to submit updates. So trying to stay on top of this is actually a really big job. One point I want to emphasize is we don't always force people to choose between their outside interest and their participation in research. Sometimes we put in place what's called a management plan. And the management plan is a series of protections that we put in place in order to create an arm's length relationship between the PI who may have an outside interest and the subjects and the data. So that if anybody ever were to say, yes, but you get paid by that company, we could say, well, that is true. However, somebody else did the data analysis, somebody else was looking at all the adverse events, we had protections in place. One of the ways that we manage the perception that somebody might be conflicted is through the disclosure process, meaning that in human clinical trials, when the investigator has an outside financial interest, we frequently will ask her or him to disclose in the informed consent document to the potential subjects, Dr. So-and-so is paid a speaker's fee by Pfizer. If you have any questions about this outside work activity, please talk to Dr. So-and-so about it before you decide whether to enroll in the study. And again, like I told you at the beginning of this talk, based on my own personal experience, I think that disclosure is used as a management tool because people assume that will scare people off. I'm not sure that's the case. I think the point is to be as transparent as possible and to develop trust between the investigator and the research participants. So the potential participants have a chance to ask questions. What is the nature of your relationship with Pfizer? You know, what are the expectations if I participated in this study, and how do they relate to your relationship with Pfizer? Those are reasonable questions somebody could ask before they decide whether to participate. So for you as an investigator, if you're participating either by working on somebody's grant or by working on somebody's protocol, whether or not it's funded by a grant, it's very likely that you will receive an email asking you to complete one of these outside financial interest disclosure forms. They're available on the CASE website. We also have guidance in the Office of Research Administration web space about how to answer the questions. You log into this system that we call SpiderWeb. You use your CASE network user ID, and you log in, and it asks you a series of questions about whether you get income from entities outside of the institution. And again, if you get income from, you know, something that you do that's totally unrelated to your research, like you sell paintings or you're a day stock trader or something like that, if it's not at all related to your research, you disclose it, and then it's very likely that nothing else happens, but we just have it on file. But if you disclose an outside interest that appears related or in any way overlapping with your research activities, we're going to dig a little bit deeper. And then, as I have said several times, the expectation is that you will either update the form annually or as frequently as is required if your financial circumstances change. The other thing we ask you to do is be thoughtful about this. You know, consider whether your outside activities may influence your behavior at work. And if so, could it influence your behavior at work in a way that could reduce your objectivity in the conduct of science? Because so much of this is built on a kind of an honor code. And just like we talked about plagiarism and falsification yesterday, you know, similarly today, what we're concerned about is your ability to do the right thing when nobody's checking on you, just because it's the right thing to do. If ever you should have a question about whether an outside activity could be construed as posing a conflict with your research, you can also just consult us. You can call us or email us and ask us a hypothetical. Just suppose you had a friend who had stock, and we're happy to answer questions like that. We're not going to ask you to give us your tax forms or anything. We're there to help. So this is what the form looks like when you log on. It's just a very, you know, kind of skeletal data input form. It'll tell you if your previous ones were done. So like in this case, you can see that this person submitted one in 2010 and 2011 in January, and now in March, they're doing another one. And then I've provided here at the end for you links not only to our campus policy, but also to the webpage for the Outside Interests Committee and some frequently asked questions about conflicts of interest. So I just want to reiterate as a final thought that I said at the beginning of this talk that having interests in and of themselves is not a bad thing, and even having conflicts is not inherently harmful. Presumably, we're all intelligent, interesting people who are interested in more than one thing, and it's possible for our outside activities to occasionally, you know, overlap with the universe of stuff we do at work. That's fine. But as members of the scientific community, it's our responsibility to address conflicts that can compromise our objectivity so that the public will trust us and will trust our research findings. Those are my prepared remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Nobody has questions? It was perfectly clear. Yes?
Face financial conflicts, but what about other conflicts, like, I don't know, like different views or beliefs, like say you're in a PETA group or something,
Yeah.
very animal rights type of that, how would you go about that?
That's a great question. I don't know if everybody heard it. The question was, what about non-financial kinds of conflicts? And the example that was given had to do with personal beliefs that might conflict with work. Using PETA as an example is helpful because you know, we probably wouldn't want somebody sitting on the animal use committee who was a covert PETA operative, right? And actually, this is part of PETA's strategy, is that they typically do try to infiltrate large research universities, either with staff in the animal care facility or on committees. I personally have seen this happen. We ask people to disclose in the committee process if they have an outside interest that could influence their conduct on the committee. What we can't do is personally investigate everybody to make sure they're telling the truth. So if somebody was really bent on lying in order to get access to something to gum up the works, it would be hard to address that through the system of oversight that we have right now. A lot of this is built on honor. So I'm going to step aside from that example for a second and use something that is, that doesn't involve deception of any kind. What if your personal beliefs just make it very difficult for you to work in a lab where certain kinds of activities are going on? What are your options? I'm not sure I would call it a conflict of interest in this sense, because it's not like you're outside, it's not like you want to do the mouse work, but you're against the mouse work. Probably if you're against the mouse work, you don't also want to be doing it. You know what I mean? So partly people need to be honest with themselves about what their limitations are, so that when they're choosing a lab, if they really believe, for example, that the use of stem cells is wrong, they should investigate the PI, what the PI's group is doing and what's going on in that lab, and not volunteer to join a lab that's using stem cells, as an example. But we don't, in direct response to your question, we don't have any kind of regulatory apparatus for investigating or validating whether people's personal beliefs or convictions might in any way interfere with their ability to fully perform their work in a lab setting. It does come up. We just don't have a review process for that sort of thing. I think it would be the kind of thing that talking with your mentor or your advisor would be the first step in trying to resolve a conflict like that. That would be like a personal conflict, as opposed to one the institution would typically get involved in managing. Any other questions? Nope? Okay, well, I invite you to follow up with me if you have questions later, whether they're about conflict of interest or not. Thanks for your attention.
Just wait. It's okay. Can I just grab my mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just really quick wanted to follow up on the last question that was asked regarding other conflicts of interest. Remember, conflicts are something that occur in our personal life or professional life, just to go back to reiterate that example, and they're decisions that we'll have to make all the time. These, again, need to be discussed. You need to be open and honest about them, and keep an eye out for them. Just because they exist doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a conflict, but we all have competing interests, and we need to actually just realize that and appreciate that. So you have a little longer lunch today, which is very nice. Again, if you could sign in with your small groups when you get there at 1, and then I will see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock again.